You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 19th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 1500 in Tokyo, 8 a.m. in Ljubljana, 7 a.m. here at Midori House in London, and 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Globalist starts now. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Seoul raises the alarm as the Russian President Vladimir Putin arrives in North Korea for talks with Kim Jong-un. Also ahead.
Over the last 2 years, since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, we became stronger. Our institutions became more resilient. We're investing much more in our defence.
That's the National Security Advisor to the Moldovan president. We'll find out how Moldova has learned to adapt to war on its doorstep. Plus the papers, and our Tokyo bureau chief will explain why a developer built a 10-storey block of apartments only to agree to tear it down just before completion. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is to succeed Jens Stoltenberg as NATO chief. The Dutch national broadcaster NOS reported Mr. Stoltenberg's appointment after Hungary and Slovakia backed him. Mexico has signed an agreement with Switzerland to protect its interests in Ecuador after the two Latin American nations severed relations. And the computer chip manufacturer Nvidia has become the world's most valuable company. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, one country which has been monitoring Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea with particular closeness is South Korea. It's understood that the first Vice Foreign Minister Kim Hong-kyun and the US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell held an emergency phone call last week to discuss President Putin's trip. Well, to tell us more and to get the reaction from Seoul, let's hear now from John Lee, editor of Korea Pro. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you back. So just explain to us that the latest is that Vladimir Putin arrived in the wee hours of the morning, and then as soon as daybreak came around, Putin and Kim Jong-un held a summit meeting after a grand welcome ceremony involving pictures of the two men and balloons. I mean, how has that gone down in Seoul?
Well, right now, the South Korean government, as you said, is watching this very closely. This is the first time that Putin has visited North Korea in 24 years. The last time he visited, he met Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. And while this has not yet been confirmed, the Russian news agency TASS has reported that before leaving for North Korea, Vladimir Putin okayed the signing of a comprehensive agreement with North Korea, a comprehensive partnership agreement. Now, what this would do, if it becomes reality, is that it would completely upgrade any and all cooperation between Russia and North Korea, whether we talk about technology or trade or tourism or, of course, military trade as well. It's just one step below a mutual defense pact. And so South Korea is quite worried about what this might mean for its own security.
What could it mean for its own security?
Well, there have been a lot of reports and about how North Korea supplied Russia with artillery shells and also ballistic missiles. And the question is, what is North Korea getting in return for all of this? Are they getting any kinds of technological aid for their missiles or for their satellites? If it does, this would compromise South Korea's security quite a bit. It would weaken South Korea's ability to monitor North Korea and also to hide its military assets from North Korea.
And one of the things that the South has said is that a very straightforward exchange is that the North is getting shipments of food because there is a huge shortage of food in North Korea. But there is also the other more worrying issues of, well, it's twofold, isn't it? Firstly, it's the space and satellite program that North Korea wishes to develop. And secondly, there are nuclear secrets which Russia could pass on.
Uh, the nuclear secrets are not that big of a concern because North Korea already has their own nuclear weapons. They do not need any further nuclear assistance from from Russia to completely wipe out South Korea if they ever so chose to do so. But satellites, that's going to be a big thing. The North Koreans have made no secret of the fact that they've been trying to launch spy satellites, and they've had some successes, but not too many. But Russia has had decades of this sort of experience, and they could really boost North Korea's space technology.
And tell us a little bit more about, how that would how boosting North Korea's space technology could be a threat to the South.
Well, so far, without the kind of GPS technology that South Korea possesses, North Korea has had a lot of trouble being able to monitor South Korea's exact troop and military asset movements, specifically naval movements. But with advanced technology, they will be able to monitor where the ships are traveling, and ships are quite a big deal. And that's because one of the things that Kim Jong-un has said is that he refuses to recognize the NLL, that stands for the Northern Limit Line. That's the maritime border that separates North and South Korea. This is a border that North Korea has said that is unfair and it has never recognized. But if it's able to track and monitor South Korean naval ship movements, it might be able to position its submarines in a way that might actually be very lethal to South Korean ships.
And how worried is the South about that?
South Korea is quite worried about this, actually. More than just the ships, there have been a lot of concurrent movements that have been going on at the same time. For instance, satellite imagery has shown that the North Koreans have been building new forward defense positions in the military demarcation line, the MDL. But the problem with the new defense lines that the North Koreans have been building is that some of them have been crossing over the MDL line and have extended into South Korea. Now, it's not that big. It's only about 30 meters, and it doesn't really serve any tactical military advantage. But it is one of those low provocation attempts that are specifically designed to get South Korea to respond in a disproportionate manner.
Tell us a little bit more about how the South might have to change its stance and its behaviour on the global stage as a result of this this closeness of ties between Russia and the North. I mean, for example, it was suggested that if South Korea would ever consider providing weapons to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia, this visit to Pyongyang by Vladimir Putin might make them think twice.
Putin's visit to North Korea is certainly a thumb in the eye of South Korea right now. Putin, in fact, expressed appreciation, quote unquote, that South Korea had never supplied weapons to Ukraine. It has sold weapons to the US and Poland, which in turn used those weapons to provide to Ukraine. But South Korea has never done so directly. But now that Putin has actually gone to North Korea and actually met with Kim Jong-un and is potentially upgrading those two countries' ties, South Korea is now in a bind. It's not crossed any of Russia's red lines, but Russia seems to be willing to cross South Korea's red lines. And so, of course, South Korea has some options available to it. Now, the most obvious ones are to strengthen its alliance and partnerships with the US and Japan. But that's a given. But the more unpredictable thing about what South Korea might be willing to do is to actually engage in China much more. Over the past 2 years, South Korea's engagement with China has been not that great. In fact, the ties between South Korea and China have deteriorated quite a bit. But now that Russia is now squeezing into the Korean Peninsula and is increases influence on Pyongyang, there is a very good chance that the Yoon administration might have no choice but to try to improve ties with China. Now, that could also have blowback in the sense that it could also make Washington and Tokyo a bit wary about what Seoul is trying to do. But at this moment, Seoul doesn't really have a lot of good options.
I mean, we talked not very long ago, right here on this very same radio station, about how for the first time in 9 years, South Korea and China have held high-level talks on diplomacy and security. Is there a sense that Seoul could proactively be pushed towards Beijing simply because of what is happening in the north?
Precisely. Now, this was not deliberate. It was actually quite coincidental. But South Korea and China had their 2+2 talks just yesterday. That's the foreign and defense ministries of both countries. They were in the vice ministerial level. But these are the sorts of talks that countries usually have, where they hammer out details that eventually leadership summits will only appear after everything has been completed. And so there have been increased signs of negotiations between South Korea and China. Now, there's a long way to go. There's been quite a large amount of trust that has been lost between Seoul and Beijing over the past 2 years. But yeah, as you said, Seoul is now finding itself being thrust to side a bit more closely with China than the Yoon administration might have been willing to do initially.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the US administration and South Korea. We've mentioned the concerns when it comes to South Korea moving a little bit further towards China, but we began this conversation by talking about how the first vice foreign minister in Seoul and the US Deputy Secretary of State had an emergency phone call. There's clearly a closeness here, which you said was a given, but how much closer could they get?
How much closer could they get? The biggest thing that they could do is to really emphasize the Nuclear Consultative Group, the NCG. The NCG being the group behind allowing South Korea to participate with talks on how the U.S. nuclear planning would go. But of course, this will not have any sort of implications of South Korea having any say in how the U.S. would use the nuclear weapons, but it would give a much more stronger cohesion between these two allies. Now, right now, even if South Korea finds itself having no choice but to side a bit more closely with China, the U.S. Under the Biden administration might be a bit more willing to see things and understand Seoul's position. But that could potentially change if there's a change in leadership in the U.S. This coming November. If Donald Trump comes back to office and he sees what Seoul is trying to do, things might change quite drastically for the next 4 years.
John Lee, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Hundreds of people took to the streets of the Kenyan capital Nairobi yesterday, angry at a proposed finance bill that protesters fear will push the cost of living even higher. More than 200 people were arrested, including journalists. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Navina Kotto, Monocle's Nairobi correspondent. Good morning, Navina.
Good morning, Emma.
So what were people angry about?
People were really angry about suggested tax hikes on staples like bread, cooking oil. The government had also suggested to tax mobile money transfers. Most money transfers here are not made in cash. They're made from mobile phone to mobile phone or mobile phone to an account. And also an insurance tax that was supposed to come in on motorbikes and cars. So in the end, the protesters basically forced the government to make quite a U-turn, and the government has announced that these tax hikes that I just mentioned will be dropped.
Well, indeed, what some people have said immediately after is because the government announced it would drop some of these new taxes, that this actually was a bit of a PR exercise. How accurate an accusation is that?
It could have been a PR exercise. I have to say, President Ruto is incredibly unpopular. He has increased taxes on fuels, taxes on salaries. Overall, people feel incredibly squeezed. And I think he's very concerned about his re-election campaign that's coming up in 2 years' time. So maybe this was an easy one to drop. Maybe he was also advised by economists that these tax hikes would ultimately stifle economic growth in the country that is desperately needed.
So tell us a little bit more about what needs to be done to sort of reignite this economic growth. Clearly, large tax hikes are not one of them.
Tax hikes might be one of them. The IMF, which was in support of this bill, says that Kenya needs to broaden its tax base, that it needs to collect more taxes. The issue really is that people feel, probably rightly so, that only very poor people or the middle class has to pay taxes and gets nothing in return. People still pay for healthcare, they pay for education. So they're kind of wondering where these taxes are going. And I think the other issue is that they see their political leaders, who are usually often businessmen in the country as well. President Ruto is the biggest farmer in Kenya, kind of evading this tax system and not really paying what they are supposed to pay.
Tell us a little bit more about William Ruto. I mean, he campaigned on a platform to make standards better for people when he was elected 2 years ago, wasn't he? What went wrong?
I think it's been a really tricky situation. I think it's important to acknowledge that William Ruto came in on a campaign of making life easier for the Kenyan hustler, as he used to say. He ran on this hustler campaign, but he also inherited a mountain of debt that needs to be serviced internationally. He needs to repay loans he took out, not he, but the previous government took out in China. But also he needs to repay IMF loans. He needs to repay at the international markets. So he's found himself in a situation where he basically has to generate a lot of money, especially in dollars, to repay this debt. And he's trying that. But at the same time, there are very few measures being taken to encourage economic growth. And I think most economists are now saying that there is not much more that can be done in terms of taxation until economic growth has picked up, until the economy has maybe diversified a bit more, and more people are in work, not just in the informal, employed properly, not just in the informal sector, in order for the tax base to broaden.
Tell us a little bit more, though, about what Ruto has been doing internationally, because he's just been to the United States for a state visit, and it was over there where he was talking to the Biden administration about investment, development deals, trying to sort out the debt, trying to spark long-term growth. Is there a sense that Ruto is fighting very hard here?
Yes, I mean, I have to say, I think it's fair to say that William Ruto is internationally probably one of the most popular African presidents on the international stage. He is either very effective at PR or being very well advised. He's selling this country as a country that wants to reform, a country that is able to, that Western donors and Western partners can rely on when it comes to security issues, when it comes to economic reform plans, when it comes to climate change issues. He's projecting himself as someone who's very cooperative. And I think it's very different to the relationship other African presidents like Museveni in Uganda, Abiy in Ethiopia, or even Cyril Ramaphosa are having with Western governments at the moment. So I think internationally he's incredibly popular. He's very good at projecting this modernized image of this country and of himself. But it's domestically where he's really struggling with his image.
Finally, let's talk about what's happening with Kenyan authorities and police officers heading to Haiti. We've had a meeting yesterday about between the Haitian police commanders and the Kenyan Inspector General of Police ahead of a deployment by the Kenyans to Haiti to try to quell some of the dreadful violence that's been seen there. I mean, what's been the reaction to Kenya by Kenyans to all this?
I mean, Kenyans are very, very skeptical that Kenya's police officers, who are notorious for being corrupt, who are notorious for being slightly heavy-handed sometimes when it comes to protests like yesterday, are well equipped to address the security situation in a country that nobody else is really prepared to get into. As you say, these about 1,000 police officers are about to be deployed by the end of this month. The Kenyan Inspector General met with the Haitian police officers yesterday. Kenya's police officers have been learning French. That's what we've been told. But the Kenyan public and Kenyan experts are very skeptical that this is really the way forward, and are basically accusing the government of, again, doing this in order to get international assistance. I think this will be, the government will be receiving millions for this deployment. But many people doubt that this is really the right approach in a place where Kenyans have never been to.
Navina Kotor, thank you so much for joining us on today's Globalist. Still to come on the programme.
Secret audio recordings, flags being flown upside down, and millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts. The US Supreme Court comes under a very uncomfortable microscope. I'm Simon Marks with that story from Washington coming up.
Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's have a look at today's papers. Joining me in the studios, Latika Burke, journalist, expert on geopolitics and writer-at-large at The Nightly, and a regular voice round the table here at Midori House. A very good morning to you, Latika.
Good morning.
How's the world in the world of Burke?
The world of Burke is great because it's such a joy to wake up at 5 a.m. and it's bright light and it's warm. What has been this winter, Emma? I was in a winter coat a week ago or so.
Anybody who's been anywhere near, I think it's most of Europe actually, is ground down by the 6th month of winter as we approach the longest day. So brighten our worlds, Latika, with a look at the papers, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I'm very struck by a story that's basically in all the papers, but of course splashed on the FT, and that's Nvidia overtaking Microsoft and Apple to become the world's most valuable publicly listed company. And this is quite huge. Now, what does Nvidia do? Well, it makes semiconductors or chips. It actually grew from a gaming company. It used to make graphic cards. So really does uphold my belief that the gamers of the world really do rule the economy in just quiet and subtle ways that nobody ever takes any notice of them. Anyway, because of artificial intelligence and, of course, this clamour for chips, the company's shares were clocking $135 US on Tuesday. Now, that took its market capitalisation to $3.335 trillion. And that puts it well ahead of Microsoft and Apple. So this is a very breakthrough moment. And I think it says a lot of things about what is happening in our economy, in our society, and also geopolitically, because for a US chip maker to be on top like this at a time where we are approaching a huge tech boom in AI, this really does once again cement just the power that the United States has on tech, as it's so anxious about China catching up to it.
It's an interesting, there's sort of two things to this, isn't it? First and foremost, it's not a front and centre company. So it's not like Apple and Microsoft. You don't have a direct dealing with it as an external consumer. So this is the first time that almost the backroom company has risen to such prominence. But also you have the fact that everybody's buying their products. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, everybody is now using Nvidia. So there's no likelihood of it going away anytime soon.
No, and the question will remain here, is this another tech bubble that we're seeing? And this is a question that the FT asks in its article, and there are some great quotes in this. There's one about from a chip analyst, Stacey Raskin, who says, "I've never seen anything quite like this in terms of the actual economics driving it. It's amazing." And then there is another analyst who says that simply they believe that this is in animal spirits territory and human emotion is taking over. It's a fantastic company. There's lots of drivers for this stock, but 40% growth in a month, that's not normal. That was Ted Mortensen, and he's a tech strategist. So really the question is this a tech bubble? Another quote in this article says there's a lot of runway left on Nvidia's growth and in terms of chips altogether, but I think that will certainly be making people feel a bit uneasy as they see this market capitalisation, which is bigger than some economies, of course.
Let's have a look at another story that you've picked up in The Guardian. It's more than 550 Hajj pilgrims die in Mecca as temperatures exceed 50 Celsius. It says at least 320 of the dead are from Egypt. Saudi officials are treating more than 2,000 people for heat stress. I mean, the Hajj is an astonishing thing to witness every single year, but the fact is that Saudi prides itself on being able to get this right. But sometimes with the temperature more than 50, there is nothing that people can do.
Yeah, there's some interesting components to this story. One, of course, is this scorching heat wave that's also happening in the United States. It's happening in the Middle East, as we're, of course, all shivering through what feels like winter and summer in Europe. But one of the really interesting factors as to these deaths is this article says there's about 323 of the 550 dead who are considered Egyptian, and many of those were unregistered. And this is a problem because the Saudis take it as a big measure of pride to host the pilgrimage. And they do want to obviously keep everybody alive. Over the past few years, we've seen major problems with crowd crushes leading to deaths. Now, of course, heat stress and climate change, which is only going to worsen and is already worsening decade on decade, is the other big challenge for the Saudi authorities. And they do provide air-conditioned stoppages on the way, but not to people who are unregistered. And of course, a lot of people try and do this pilgrimage unregistered. So we're seeing some interesting interplay there between how people approach this pilgrimage and the Saudis' own ability to keep people safe during it. And one of the staggering kind of statistics here is the temps hit 51.8 degrees at the Grand Mosque in Mecca on Monday. But overall, temperatures in this region are increasing 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade. So in another 10 years, Emma, you and I could be sitting here and talking about an even worse case scenario.
One thing that's interesting, though, is that Saudi has embarked upon a brand new non-religious, a sort of a leisure tourism push, building huge resorts along the Red Sea, even skiing resorts up in the mountains. And it is trying to position itself as a new country, a country worth going to, and building on its reputation of hundreds, if not thousands of years of executing the Hajj pilgrimage so well. And what does this do for its more leisure tourism view?
I think there's two separate factors there. I mean, one is involving major crowds who are coming anyway, but from the region. The second is aimed primarily at people like you and me and Monocle listeners. They're trying to get Westerners to come and visit Saudi. I'm not entirely sure Saudi has jumped that final hurdle. I think the business community is there with Saudi. I think the political community is there with Saudi. I'm not really sure it passes what I call the Instagram test, which is if someone like you or me put on Instagram, hey, I'm in Jordan taking a holiday, people would go, wow, where is that? I want to go there. If I put up a photo saying this is Saudi, people would say, what on earth are you doing there supporting a human rights violator in the Saudi government? Now, of course, there are a lot of governments and a lot of countries that people might travel to which aren't great on human rights, but Saudi in particular has a problem, I think, since the killing of Khashoggi.
Let's move to a story that you've actually written on The Nightly. Thank you for bringing your own work in. That's great. Talking about so we're talking about AUKUS and the sort of the fabled security alliance among the likes of the Australians, the Brits and the United States. Works a treat when you have Joe Biden in power, were Trump to seize power and to be voted into the White House in November. What does this mean for AUKUS?
Well, the reason I brought this one to the table is because I attended this talk on Monday in London with Elbridge Colby. Now, anyone who knows of Elbridge Colby's work knows that he is a big, I suppose you could say he wouldn't describe it as isolationist, but he certainly articulates the Donald Trump America First isolationist view of the world. This includes telling Europe, we are not going to be there for you in Ukraine. You need to sort yourselves out. NATO's Article 5 doesn't necessarily mean we come to your rescue, Europe. You also need to sort yourself out. And when this was then extrapolated further to AUKUS, jaws in this room did literally drop, because this is a pact to build submarines and provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines to try and contain China, which is the very threat that Colby says we need to get away from Europe to focus on China and try and contain their rise. And so when this was put to him, would you have signed off on AUKUS yourself if you were Donald Trump's security advisor? He says, look, I would have been very sceptical. He's concerns are twofold. One, he doesn't think the program will deliver submarines in time to contain a Chinese takeover of Taiwan at any rate. Now, he's not Robinson Crusoe there. There's plenty of people who say that. The second part is more concerning. He says, why are we giving away the crown jewels in terms of our nuclear-powered submarines, that technology, to Australia when Australia can't even guarantee us that it will come and actually work with us in a Taiwan scenario? That's a very legitimate question. And I actually asked him, and now the reason why Elbridge Colby is important is because, Emma, one of the questions I asked him was, look, everybody says you're auditioning to be Donald Trump's next security advisor, are you? And he certainly did not say no. He answered in that usual political way, which is, look, I certainly would be honoured to serve. That's a giant yes. So this is hugely concerning for Australia and for the United Kingdom because there's literally tens of billions of dollars wrapped up in this program.
Finally, let's touch briefly in the seconds that we have left on a beautiful article in the New York Times about how cricket, the most staid and genteel of sports, has suddenly found itself in a home in the rather, dare we say, noisier United States.
I absolutely adore this story. So last year, unbeknownst to me, there have been a couple of teams established in the United States to play a cricket league. Now, this is all catapulted into their hosting of the T20 World Cup, in which a couple of weeks ago the United States staged a massive upset and beat Pakistan. And what this has spawned is a huge interest in cricket, which of course baseball evolved from and took over as cricket's any presence of cricket in the United States in the 19th century. Well, now it could be a case that it's not the British taking cricket to India, but the South Asian diaspora surging a revival in this sport because people like Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella have bought into these teams and are promoting the conversion of old baseball stadiums back into cricket grounds. And, of course, the TV streaming rights are now finding an audience where perhaps 10, 20 years ago they might not. So will cricket become a thing in the United States?
We'll have to see. What is worth looking at is that article because it is absolutely full of smiling, joyful faces. Latika Burke, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is just nudging 7:32 a.m. A quick look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is to succeed Jens Stoltenberg as NATO chief. The Dutch national broadcaster NOS reported Mr. Stoltenberg's appointment after Hungary and Slovakia backed him. Mexico has signed an agreement with Switzerland to protect its interests in Ecuador after the two Latin American nations severed relations. Ecuadorian police and soldiers broke into Mexico's embassy in Quito in April, arresting Ecuador's former vice president who'd taken refuge in the embassy. And the computer chip manufacturer Nvidia has become the world's most valuable company. The firm's share price climbed to an all-time high on Tuesday, making it more valuable than Microsoft. It overtook Apple earlier this month. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, the reputation of the United States Supreme Court has been called once more into question after one of its justices was heard endorsing the notion that the country should seek to return to a place of godliness. Justice Samuel Alito, a Republican appointee to the court's 9-member bench, was secretly recorded at an event in Washington. Well, his comments have fueled an intense debate about whether the court, with its new Republican-appointed majority, is at risk of becoming politicised. From Washington, here's Simon Marks.
The year was 1962. The US Supreme Court had just delivered a landmark opinion, and President John F. Kennedy's reaction to it was featured on America's Universal Newsreel.
The first question at President Kennedy's news conference deals with the Supreme Court decision that a New York school prayer violates constitutional separation of church and state. The president's statement is in the nature of an effort to calm the storm.
The Supreme Court has made its judgment. A good many people obviously will disagree with it. Others will agree with it. It is important for us, if we're going to maintain our constitutional principle, that we support Supreme Court decisions, even when we may not agree with them.
For decades, that was the way things were in Washington. Successive presidents and sessions of Congress tiptoeing carefully to avoid any criticism of the US Supreme Court, the third co-equal branch of the American government as laid out in the country's constitution. How things have changed.
The Supreme Court has never been as out of kilter as it is today.
President Biden in Los Angeles last weekend warning of the dangers that he says Donald Trump created when, as president, he had the opportunity to nominate 3 Republicans to the court's 9-member bench. That resulted in a conservative majority of justices on the court, and the president says his rival this November must not get the chance to nominate any more.
The next president is likely to have 2 new Supreme Court nominees. The idea that if he's reelected, he's going to appoint 2 more flying flags upside down is really, I really mean it.
That reference to flags flying upside down goes to the heart of the current scandal buffeting the court. Within the last few weeks, it has emerged that in January of 2021, the American flag flew upside down outside the home of Samuel Alito, one of 6 Republican-nominated Supreme Court justices. The banner was a widely used symbol of Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign, falsely alleging the 2020 presidential election was rigged. Alito says the flag had nothing to do with him and was related to a dispute between his wife and some of their neighbours in a suburb just outside Washington. But his wife, Martha Ann Alito, says she wishes she could have gone further.
I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month.
Exactly.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up and I'm going to send them a message every day.
That secretly recorded audio was gathered by a left-wing activist at a Supreme Court Historical Association dinner last month in Washington. And as you heard on the tape, the activist, Lauren Windsor, egged the Alitos on in an effort to encourage them to think that she was just like them, a Christian conservative. She managed to make Justice Alito sufficiently comfortable that he embraced the view that America, in which the separation between church and state is constitutionally guaranteed, should become a more godly nation. Coexistence with those who disagree he called difficult.
One side or the other is going to win. There can be a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised.
Those comments infuriated Democrats at the White House and on Capitol Hill.
Justice Alito should not sit on any of these cases involving Donald Trump. He ought to recuse himself.
Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, one of many prominent Democrats who argue that Alito must now step down from at least 2 cases currently before the court that could directly impact the outcome of this year's presidential election. One of them will determine whether Trump enjoys blanket immunity from prosecution for his actions when he was in office. The other will decide whether participants in the January the 6th uprising 3 years ago by Trump supporters were properly prosecuted for obstructing an official proceeding in Congress.
Here's the challenge to Chief Justice Roberts. The United States Supreme Court's credibility is plummeting, and it is due to the Supreme Court's own self-inflicted wounds.
Those wounds are also attributed to another Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas. It's been revealed that he and his wife received gifts worth millions of dollars from a Republican mega-donor, including 38 vacations, 26 flights on private jets, VIP passes to major sporting events, and even payments that stopped Justice Thomas from having to sell his mother's home. Ginny Thomas, his wife, attended Donald Trump's rally on January the 6th that led to the attack on Capitol Hill, and has publicly maintained that President Biden stole the 2020 election. The Democrats' leader in the House of Representatives is Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York.
The problem that we confront is that the Supreme Court has chosen to conduct itself as if the judiciary is above the law.
Republicans argue that is nonsense, and the activities, particularly of the wives of Supreme Court justices, do not necessarily have any bearing on their husbands' interpretation of the American Constitution.
I think the Supreme Court justices in general have done a good job. I wish we'd do a better job of protecting them.
Conservative talk show host Clay Travis is one of many on the right defending Justice Alito's secretly recorded comments and pointing to the court's opinion only last week that kept the abortion pill mifepristone on the market as a fresh indication that the justices are not avowedly political.
It's not like he said, oh yeah, I'm on the Supreme Court and my belief is that the Ten Commandments is the only law that exists anywhere in the world. I mean, if anything, I thought that the decision that came down right afterwards, 9-0 on the morning after pill, was pretty straightforward answer that we don't live in a Christian theocracy and that everything is still subject to the rule of law.
But the court's own goals are on the mind of Chief Justice John Roberts, himself a Republican appointee. Late last year, he implemented a new ethics code. Critics on the left say it has no enforcement mechanism and is insufficient, while those on the right accuse him of unnecessarily caving in to pressure. The Chief Justice himself was caught on tape at last month's dinner, along with the Alitos, but was notably far more restrained when activist Lauren Windsor tried to get him to embrace the concept of America becoming a God-fearing Christian nation.
I don't know that we live in a Christian nation. I know a lot of Jewish and Muslim friends who would say maybe not. And it's not our job to do that.
But the Chief Justice knows the institution on which he and his 8 colleagues serve for life is now in the political crosshairs like never before. The era of hallowed reverence and respect for the Supreme Court has passed, and the justices are now being scrutinised not just for their rulings, but for what they say and do in their lives as private citizens as well. For Monocle Radio, I'm Simon Marks in Washington.
Thank you, Simon. You're with Monocle Radio. It's 9:40 a.m. in Chisinau and 8:40 a.m. in Zurich. Now, the recent summit on peace in Ukraine saw more than 160 delegations from around the world congregate in the Bergenstock resort in Switzerland. A path to peace was at the top of the agenda, along with the spillover impact of the conflict on other nations and what Putin's aggression could mean for other European countries, including Moldova. Monocle's contributing editor Andrew Muller met with the National Security Advisor to Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, at the event to talk about the impact of the war on Chisinau's security and if a resolution could encourage an end to the dispute with the breakaway region of Transnistria. Well, Andrew began by asking Stanislav Sikreu what discussions have been like between the various heads of state.
I think our message is that we need a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine, and based only on respect of UN Charter. The most important thing, that peace can be sustained only if the borders are respected, territorial integrity is respected. Last session, there was a discussion about how to enforce these basic international norms.
I mean, I suspect I don't have to ask really, but what were your views on President Putin's suggestions on the eve of the summit?
The message of our president is that peace cannot be based on occupation. Peace cannot be based on surrender to aggressor. Peace can be based only on full respect of territorial integrity of each country member of United Nations. This is the message which is coming from our president.
This is obviously very real to Moldova because you are right next to Ukraine. You have for a very long period had a portion of your territory occupied effectively or indeed actually by Russia. President Sandu said yesterday that, as she put it, Ukraine's peace is Moldova's peace. How vulnerable does Moldova feel to you still?
Moldova has to face several security threats, which are conventional and non-conventional. But over the last 2 years, since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, we became stronger. Our institutions became more resilient. We're investing much more in our defense. We are building institutions which will help to deflect Russian hybrid attacks. And in these efforts, we benefit of a generous support of our partners, EU member states, United States, United Kingdom. We are pretty confident that we can stay our course. We can pursue our future which is European integration, and to be in the position to defend ourselves from Russian hybrid attacks, which are happening every day.
I mean, on the subject of defending yourself, is there any talk in Moldova, or do you think there should be, about Article 11 of your constitution, rather, which of course guarantees Moldova's neutrality, or do you think that EU membership would be sufficient security?
It's for Moldovan people to decide what they would like to have in the constitution, because constitution can be amended only with active involvement of society. Secondly, the status of neutrality doesn't mean that a country doesn't have to invest in its own defense, because as a neutral country, Moldova is not part of any alliance. Third element, yes, we believe that joining the European Union will ensure our security. That's why in our national security strategy, the joining European Union is a national security objective, because EU, it's not only access to European market, it's also to be part of a community which provides solidarity and helps each other in difficult situations.
When you look at what's being discussed and what's being proposed at this summit, do you see, I guess, any seeds of a possible resolution for the Transnistria scenario here? Is there a model being developed which could possibly one day apply to helping Moldova restore its own complete territorial integrity?
Our position on the resolution of Transnistrian conflict is that we militate only for peaceful resolution of conflict. Secondly, we think that we have to work actively to bring closer people living on two banks of Dnistru River in the aspects of economy and social aspects. Then there will be a geopolitical opportunity to find a political solution to the conflict. We are ready to engage in this kind of talks. Until then, we are trying to reintegrate country, firstly, in the economic field and then in social field as well. Hopefully, that when there is a favorable security context, we might think about political solution. Obviously, the resolution of conflict will be closely dependent on how the war in Ukraine ends. The outcome of war will shape as well the environment in which we will be looking for solution of our conflict.
Has that war in Ukraine changed at all the dynamic between Chisinau and Tiraspol? Is there any kind of ongoing dialogue between Moldova and the regime in Transnistria?
Obviously, the war impacted the dynamic between Chisinau and Tiraspol, because partially it reflected in other formats, 5+2, which became impossible to use because of two members of this format in direct war, and it's difficult to imagine how we are going to work in this format. Second element, there is a more frequent dialogue on one-on-one between Chisinau and Tiraspol to address issues which are affecting citizens living on both banks of the river. This dialogue sometimes was not easy, but it's productive. And we have proven in those 2.5 years that this dialogue helped to preserve stability and address certain issues which are of importance for citizens living on both banks of the river.
But I guess, and this possibly is an overly optimistic way of looking at things, do you think there's any way in which the situation in Ukraine, if that is resolved, might actually hasten or contribute to a resolution of the Transnistria situation?
Depending on how we define the positive scenario in Ukraine, how positive it is, the gradation of positivity, obviously it will create a favorable environment to address this long-standing issue. But I wouldn't say that it will be automatically, because more other factors have to fall into the puzzle in order to address this issue in a comprehensive and sustainable way.
And that was Andrew Muller hearing from the Moldovan National Security Advisor Stanislav Sucreu. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, a property developer in Tokyo has agreed to knock down a block of flats just weeks before completion. The reason? The development was blocking the locals' cherished view of Mount Fuji. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Fiona Wilson, Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief. A very good afternoon to you, Fiona.
Hi, Emma.
So this is 10 stories high, but not acceptable.
I mean, this is such an extraordinary story. If you've ever been involved in any kind of campaign to try and stop developers doing what they want to do in Tokyo, it's pretty much impossible. So these particular developers haven't broken a law. What they'd done was they built this 10-story apartment block in a little, it's Kunitachi, it is part of Tokyo, it's far west of Tokyo. And at the end of this street, the clue is in the name, it's called Fujimi Dori, which means Fuji Viewing Street. They'd blocked the view of Mount Fuji. And there'd been quite a long campaign by residents saying, it kind of ruins the whole point of the street. And it kind of ruined the town, really. And the developers suddenly, it was about to open in July, there were 18 apartments, and they suddenly said, actually, we've realised we've ruined the view and we're going to demolish the building.
How did they get so close to completion without realising this was going to annoy a lot of people? Because it's not as if Mount Fuji pops up from nowhere all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Well, they had already slightly adjusted the design. I mean, in such a minor way. I think they'd taken a floor off it. It was going to be 11 stories. But I think it'd just been rumbling on. And when you see the images of the street with and without the block, it is quite dramatic. It had this amazing street, and at the end, you just had this perfect view of Mount Fuji. And, Mount Fuji is just the most spectacular mountain, volcano, I should say. It's this amazing conical shape, and it's really important in Japan. It pops up. You can be in places in Tokyo. My apartment building, for example, it's only 3 floors high, my apartment building, but you can see Mount Fuji from the top. And even in Tokyo, it's very, very important. It really grounds people. And, it's right in the middle of Japan, and you can see it from all over the place. And it's just a very, very important peak.
Tell us, how precious is the idea of a view in Japan? I mean, you talked about the fact that the street in which this block of flats was built did actually have the reference to the fact that you could see Mount Fuji beautifully from it. But there have been incidents in the last few weeks and months, haven't there, where people have cherished views so much that things have been done?
Yeah, I mean, I think Fujimi as a name does pop up all around Mount Fuji. This is Fuji viewing. Having the ability to see Mount Fuji is really important. And Mount Fuji has been for 1,000 years. It's a sacred mountain for the Japanese. It's a centre of ascetic Buddhism. There's believed to be a Shinto deity in the crater. People have been painting this thing for 1,000 years. I mean, and one of the most famous images from Japan is Hokusai's wave. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That picture is actually a picture of Mount Fuji. If you look at it again, many people don't even notice it's a view of Mount Fuji, and it comes from this series that Hokusai did called 36 Views of Mount Fuji. It's just such an iconic image for Japan. And I think in Tokyo, people accept that the city has got much more vertical in recent years. But even here, people, when there's a view to be had, people seek it out.
Tell us a little bit more about the willingness for people to tear things down in Japan. I mean, I think it would be arguably pretty unheard of that once you got 10 floors up that a developer would willingly tear stuff down. But is there a culture in Japan whereby people are more willing, I think we've talked about this before, people are more willing to sort of dispose of their buildings simply for the sake of building new ones?
Yeah, there's definitely this sort of scrap and build culture that people often talk about, maybe hopefully slightly less than there was, and people are looking a bit more, thinking a bit more about longevity. But this situation's very unusual where somebody would build something new and demolish it. That I just don't know. I've not heard of that unless there's something wrong with the building, a law has been broken. And the developers were very keen to say, look, we haven't done anything wrong. We just know it's not right. So they haven't actually broken any laws. There's a strange thing about development in Tokyo. You'll know if you've been here. It's quite a jumble. And people say, are there any regulations here? Well, there are very strict regulations about depriving your neighbour of their sunlight. So that can be one of the key things. Aesthetically, you can pretty much do what you like, but you can't block their sunlight. So that's the sort of, the development picture is very different from, say, a city like London. It's less about protecting the facades of a building, and it's more about sort of people's, its light is really important. And I think these views of Fuji, it's often recorded when a view disappears. People do make note of it. There were a couple of famous views in the time I've been here that have gone, and yeah, they do make note of it.
Finally, Fiona, briefly, what's going to happen to the people who bought flats?
Well, you know what? They have all gone absolutely silent. So I do hope they've had a big old payday, because They certainly haven't complained. And it's interesting, of course, reporters have descended on this little place and said, what do you all think? I think people are a bit baffled. Honestly, there was a campaign, but I think they're amazed at the outcome. And the people who have bought the places have gone very quiet. So I imagine they've been compensated for their trouble.
Fiona Wilson in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now, it is almost 50 days until the start of the Olympics in Paris, and while preparations are well underway, and Paris is frankly quite routine at this sort of thing, we're looking this week to who will be hosting games in the next decade. That's because Egypt's making a play for the 2036 Olympics. The next one's open for bids, and they would become the first nation on the African continent to host the games. Well, earlier Monocle's Chris Chermak heard from Dr. Camilla Swart Aris, who's Associate Professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University's College of Science and Engineering. She began by talking about Egypt's prospects in the race.
I think it's an exciting time, as you said, probably long overdue to consider an African bid. So I think in terms of prospects, I think what Egypt has going for itself is that the new process of dialogue makes it easier for a country on the African continent to host the games. And I think it's also in terms of the changes in the IOC with Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2020+5, which allows a different kind of thinking that makes it quite attractive for Egypt to host in the building of the new administrative capital, which will serve as the Olympic city.
And tell us a little more about kind of the challenges here for a Cairo or a place like Egypt, or the new city, as it were. What kind of help do they potentially need in order to host something like the Olympics? Because this has always been the problem, hasn't it? We're kind of relying these days on cities that have the infrastructure already in place, because it is pretty hard to host a big event like this.
Absolutely. So I think Egypt has gone a long way to try to build up that infrastructure, having started, the building of the city way back in 2015 already, with its national stadium and other sports facilities. But I think it also goes to a track record of hosting sporting events. And I can just talk about my own experience having worked at the Cape Town 2004 Olympic bid, albeit a long time ago. And as I mentioned, that the thinking has changed around the hosting of these mega events and trying to make it more feasible for other countries to come in and make it easier. But I think challenges are in terms of track record, hosting successful events, in terms of soft skills. Hosting so many world championships at the same time requires a wide range of skills to put these essentially world championships on and during a 2-week, effectively what is a 2-week period. So that's quite challenging. And of course, related to that are budget and financial issues. And in Qatar, in Egypt's case, they're also up against other contenders like Qatar, who is also set to host, keen to host and aspires to host an Olympic Games, potentially also for 2036.
So there will, of course, be other contenders. But just finally, tell us a little more about this shift, because I am curious when you describe this shift in tone from the IOC. I mean, what is that shift about exactly? Because it is, again, as we say, quite hard to host the Olympics. And I wonder if part of the shift is just whether, how much cities place an emphasis on almost completely transforming their city's infrastructure in order to host it. Is that where, the IOC and others can maybe make things a little bit easier?
I think it goes a long way. If I think back to the Cape Town bid, we came just out post-apartheid, and it was all about socio-economic transformation, changing the apartheid city. But I think in retrospect at that stage, the IOC was not ready for that kind of thinking. But now we see that where the city or the country needs to plan in advance for its citizens in the future and not sort of retrospectively fit the Olympic Games into a city. So I think it's a lot more positive for cities like Cairo to put the city up front and then have the games fit the development plans for the city.
That was Dr. Camilla Swart-Aris there talking to Monocle's Chris Chermak. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Vincent McAviney, Laura Kramer and Christy O'Grady. Our research was George Ruskin. Our studio manager was Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London and the Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.